We keep searching for peace throughout our lives, but the more we search, the more the mind becomes tired. External circumstances keep changing, conveniences increase, experiences deepen, yet somewhere inside a subtle dissatisfaction remains. It feels as if, despite having everything, something fundamentally remains incomplete. This incompleteness is not about any object or any person, but is the result of not being able to know oneself correctly. This inner fatigue gradually makes life burdensome. When this fatigue begins to deepen, the mind starts seeking solutions outside. Some want to change their environment, some distance themselves from relationships, and some consider meditation and silence as the ultimate remedy. Some people take renunciation as the solution. But after a short while, the same question arises again. If the mind is still not calm, despite doing all this, then where is the real problem? Is the difficulty in the world or in the perspective with which we view the world? We generally say that I'm sad, I'm confused, I'm restless. But very rarely do we examine who this I really is. According to Vedanta, the deepest mistake is to consider our existence limited only to the body and mind. When the identity becomes so narrow, peace is also sought within that limited scope, and what is sought outside cannot be permanent. For this reason, dissatisfaction remains even after renunciation, and thoughts return even after silence. The problem is not a lack of effort, but a confusion of direction. As long as the vision is directed outward, inner stability does not manifest. Recognizing this deep illusion, the ancient sages did not prescribe the attainment of something new as a solution, but rather placed the recognition of the self at the center. This is where the prelude to that teaching called Nirvana begins. This Nirvana is neither the name of a place nor a particular state. It is the recognition of that clear awareness in which the seeker becomes calm and the observer begins to see himself. From this point onward, the teaching begins that speaks not of renunciation, but of the transformation of vision. And it is here that the true flow of the Nirvana Upanishad naturally starts to progress. The point at which the seeker begins to become calm and the observer starts to observe themselves is where the true meaning of the Nirvana Upanishad gradually begins to become clear. This Upanishad resolves our fundamental assumption before any method or practice. Generally, people understand nirvana as a special state, a supernatural experience, or a distant goal. The Nirvana Upanishad calmly clarifies this misconception that nirvana is not something to be attained, but the truth that has always been present and only needs to be recognized with the right vision. According to the Upanishads, bliss is not an experience that comes and goes. Bliss is the nature of the soul. When consciousness remains bound within the limits of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, it associates itself with experiences. But when that same consciousness becomes established in itself beyond these three states, it is called transcendental bliss. Here, bliss does not appear as a new experience, but as the purification of the identity of the experiencer. In this context, the Nirvana Upanishad speaks of swamatram, which means being established only in the self, neither running outward nor trying to add something inward. When consciousness is free from external supports, thoughts, and expectations and rest in itself, true peace manifests. This peace does not arise from any effort but naturally appears at the moment when the need for effort ceases. This understanding clarifies that nirvana is not about escaping life. It does not preach the denial of the world but rather provides the vision to see the world as it truly is. When the mind begins to be free from imaginations and perceptions, the same world that once seemed like a bondage starts to feel natural and light. The Nirvana Upanishad makes it clear that bondage is not in objects, but in the mistaken identity associated with them. Based on this profound realization, the Nirvana Upanishad points towards that state which is called the state of the Paramahamsa. It is not an external rank or social identity, but an inner condition in which the soul recognizes itself not as a limited doer, but as a witness. Here the identity changes, not life. The meaning of Paramahamsa is that consciousness which, beyond the ideas of bondage and liberation, naturally becomes steady, and in which there remains no insistence on any accomplishment or special achievement. The Upanishad clarifies that renunciation is not the name of external abandonment. Symbols like the loincloth, the thread, and the staff indicate an internal state, not a mandatory conduct. True renunciation occurs only when the knot of ego, expectation, and ownership loosens. This renunciation is not of objects, but of identity. Therefore, the Paramahamsa is one who, while living in the world, remains free from the burden of the mind and stays natural amidst circumstances. In the same vein, the Upanishads use metaphors like the theory of the sky and the nectar drop. Their meaning is not to describe some mysterious realm, but to indicate that vast consciousness which is free from boundaries. When consciousness becomes as expansive as the sky, the situations that come and go in life appear like waves. They come and go, but the inner foundation remains unshaken. This stability is the true form of freedom. It is also necessary to understand that the state of a Paramahamsa is not the result of a single practice, but rather the natural fruit of the maturation of various practices. When discernment becomes clear, rules and methods become effortless on their own. The Upanishad speaks of the destruction of fear, attachment, sorrow, and anger, which does not occur through suppression, but through clear understanding. When the truth begins to be seen, the influence of untruth naturally starts to weaken. It is from this inner maturity that the role of liberation while living arises. A liberated being is not one who has cut off from the world, but one whose identity is no longer bound to the world. Actions continue, but the sense of doership loosens. This is the reason why subsequent teachings present yoga, discipline, and practice not as means to achieve a goal, but as natural methods to stabilize this clarity, which will be understood gradually. If the teaching of the Upanishad has felt true and meaningful to you deep within, then definitely like this video and share your experience by writing Nirvana in the comments. In this context of clarity, the Nirvana Upanishad further discusses yoga and discipline. Here, yoga does not mean any specific physical exercise or rigorous practice, but rather the state in which the mind loses its restlessness and becomes naturally calm. The Upanishad indicates that when discernment awakens, there is no need to forcibly restrain the mind, because its movement gradually slows down on its own. In this context, Ajapa Gayatri and the state of Unmani are mentioned. Ajapa means the repetition that continues continuously without speaking or effort. It is not the act of chanting a mantra, but the awareness of the natural flow of breath and consciousness. The Unmani state is the condition where the mind moves away from objects and begins to return to its own source. Here, no special experience is sought. Rather, the experiencer himself begins to become calm. The Upanishads also use words like Kachari Mudra and Shiva Yoga Nidra, but their purpose is not to create mystery. These words point to that inner state where consciousness rises above gross boundaries and becomes more expansive. Here, sleep does not mean ignorance, but that rest in which the mind's agitation ceases while consciousness remains awake. This very state indicates supreme bliss. The Upanishad speaks of the dissolution of fear, attachment, grief, and anger as a means to progress toward this state. This renunciation does not arise from moral pressure or external restraint, but from a clear understanding that arises within. When the practitioner realizes that fear, attachment, grief, and anger are temporary tendencies of the mind and not the nature of the soul, their influence naturally begins to weaken. This transformation does not occur in a single moment but happens gradually. However, as soon as the awareness becomes steady, this transformation becomes effortless, profound, and permanent. This is where the meaning of liberation from the cycle of life begins to become clear. A liberated being is not one who has separated from the body or the world, but one whose identity is no longer bound to them. Actions continue, but the knot of doership has loosened. The Nirvana Upanishad clarifies that liberation is not an achievement of the future, but a clear recognition situated in the present. To stabilize this recognition, the discussion then moves to celibacy, discipline, and spiritual practice, which naturally prepare one for the ultimate realization. As this final preparation, the Nirvana Upanishad points towards the realization called Advaita. Here, Advaita is not a philosophical doctrine, but a direct clarity that the seer, the act of seeing, and the seen are not actually separate. When this division begins to loosen, consciousness stabilizes in its natural form. This is the state where knowing Brahman is not an achievement of knowledge, but a spontaneous clarity of self recognition. The Upanishads repeatedly clarify that this realization is not an event that occurs at a specific time. Brahman is not a distant power, but the very consciousness through which all this is currently seen and experienced. When the veil of imagination, expectation, and fear begins to gradually lift, that same consciousness reveals itself as self luminous. To attain this, nothing needs to be added. It is sufficient for what has been falsely added to decay. In this context, the Upanishads clarify the inner meaning of words like Brahmacharya, Kanta, Kaupin, and Yajnopavita. Here, Brahmacharya does not merely mean a disciplined life, but a state in which consciousness continuously remains established in Brahman. Yajnopavita is not an external threat, but the constant remembrance of the turiya consciousness. When this vision becomes clear, every action in life becomes natural, simple, and effortless. In this state, the world neither appears to be something to be renounced nor a cause of attraction. It is seen just as it is. The Upanishads compare the world to a dream to explain its impermanence, not to deny it. When it becomes clear that the changing can never be permanent, the mind naturally turns towards the stable. This stability is the recognition of the nature of Brahman. Ultimately, the Nirvana Upanishad clarifies that liberation is not an external achievement, but a rediscovery of one's true nature. When the roots of ego, attachment, and doership loosen, life ceases to be a struggle and becomes a natural flow. This is liberation while living. This is the realization of non duality. And this is the true meaning of Nirvana. This teaching is not meant to influence anyone, but to point towards the truth that is already present at the core of every moment and every experience. If the teaching of this Upanishad touches you deeply, it is not enough to just listen and leave it at that. It is equally important to pause for a while and experience what has become clear. The Nirvana Upanishad does not urge one to adopt any particular belief, but rather provides the vision to see oneself. When a thought brings inner peace or clarifies the vision a little, it should be understood that the teaching of the Upanishad is doing its work. The deepest message of the Nirvana Upanishad is that liberation is not an achievement of the future, but an identity established in the present. This teaching inspires us to see that the bonds we struggle with are not in objects or circumstances, but lie in our mistaken identity. When this identity shifts away from the body and mind to rest in the witness, the very life that once seemed a burden begins to be experienced as a natural and light. This Upanishad also clarifies that renunciation is not an escape from life. Words like Paramahamsa, yoga, discipline, and celibacy do not indicate the necessity of external conduct, but rather point towards inner maturity. When the grip of ego, attachment, and doership loosens, actions become effortless on their own. This is the nature of liberation while living, where life does not stop, but freed from struggle, becomes a natural flow. The realization of Advaita is the pinnacle of this clarity. Here, the observer, the process of observing, and the observed do not remain separate. This is not a philosophical conclusion, but the simple naturalness of experience. The Upanishads repeatedly remind us that Brahman is not a distant power, but the very consciousness through which all this is being seen right now. When this understanding begins to stabilize, fear, attachment, and sorrow start to diminish on their own. If you found this discussion useful, liking this video is not just a formal action, but a contribution to spreading such scripturally sound and profound topics further. Share it with those who want to find solutions to life's problems, not in external measures, but in inner understanding. Such topics progress only when they receive the support of the right audience. On this channel, calm, profound, and authentic teachings of the Upanishads and Vedanta are regularly presented. If you wish to stay connected with such Upanishadic reflections, subscribing to the channel and keeping notifications on will be helpful for your future journeys. This is not a request, but a natural means for continuous study and contemplation. Please do mention in the comments which part of this Upanishad gave you the most meaningful, clear, or touching experience. Thank you.